you, everyone. So I'm going to do a couple announcements here before we get into the interview, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So here we go. I encourage everyone to grab Dean's Real Magic book. We've gotten it already for some of you guys for Christmas, and it's absolutely amazing, and we'll talk more about that tonight. If you have not answered the Citizen Science Collective Intelligence Survey for this session, there's the link, and I'll add it to the chat in just a moment. And we'll be going over the results. I want to thank our sponsor, Sedona Quantum Consciousness. Mark Simzak is now sponsoring LightNet, and we're so grateful to have a lab like this in Sedona, and a lot more tools are on the way. So thanks for supporting us and exploration here in Sedona. And I also want to thank John, Awareness Ascending. Some of you may be on the call tonight from there. We're going to be syndicating the show on the Awareness Ascending. We've been doing, John's been doing brain scans of people while they're channeling, so getting interesting results, and we're so happy to have you guys here in Sedona too. Just a reminder for the members, the first Sunday of every month, we're doing our spoon bending parties, which you guys are welcome to attend. We had 100% bending last month, so that was great. And it's a lot of fun. So again, you know, Dean has spent his entire life trying to get science caught up and these fundamental assumptions adjusted in the world. And we're kind of heading over this leap right now. And I know it's been painfully slow for Dean in the scientific world to start to bring some of this, like hundreds and hundreds of papers and 3,000 pieces of evidence with scientific study. But here at LightNet and Exo Metaverse, we're really about just, outside of the academic realm, for us just experimenting with our bodies, getting into the knowledge of the direct experience, because that's the only way to understand this stuff. And we're kind of this like army, this mass of people that are going to be following you, Dean, into this curiosity that you've staged so well. So again, the Matrix movie came out this week. And there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. So I'm just excited to be around so many curious people that are actually implementing this in their lives. And as we know, Dean was commenting before we started, it's really all about belief. And that's why we're studying a lot of big data, so that we can really show everyone that this repressed curiosity is the lid's off. Here goes. We're really excited. And for those of you that are new from the Awareness Ascending group, Exo Metaverse and LightNet, we're building a search engine for consciousness. It will be a citizen science permission slip to really get curious in small groups. We did a study last week in preparation for a funding round with someone who had epilepsy. He had a traditional doctor, an alternative doctor. And he said that 50% of his cure, he cured himself from epilepsy, was mental. So it's kind of interesting. And nutrition was not his number one thing that cured him, and hands-on healing was a huge portion of that. And he was almost embarrassed to tell me that he went to this California doctor. So times are changing, and the search engine will work like this. You'll be able to click on channeling or breathing exercises or nutrition, and you'll be able to see all his resources, courses, recommendations. And then we're going to put 100 people who've cured themselves from epilepsy, and you can start to see how this kind of statistical understanding can be very powerful. You can click on one thing and go deeper. It's kind of a shame that all this wisdom in the world is being lost in Reddit threads and emails. And so that's, again, why we're allowing people to take their personal resources, share it see how it is with their friends and also the rest of the world. And whether it's clearing your subconscious mind, or whether it's interacting with non-ordinary states of consciousness and non-human entities. This is what we found. Dreams and meditation and plant medicine, as Dean will attest, are ways to get your consciousness out of the way and actually experience things again. So again, in the next couple of months, we're going to be starting coding on the LEAP maps and living library, and we're going to be doing all this crazy experimentation in circles of 8. So welcome tonight. I'm going to bring Dean in now. Dean, thanks for being here with us on your holiday week. And we're excited to ask you Well, first of all, for those that don't know Dean, Dean is 20 years in the Institute for Noetic Science. I'm going to share some links to his webpage and also to IONS. And he's, you know, he's really been the pioneer in the consciousness scientific field, asking the right questions and taking this very seriously. You know, they say that science advances one funeral at a time, but in his lifetime, he's advanced the curiosity of the world in such a massive way. His books, his 4 books are translated in 15 languages. He's written over 300 papers, and we're really honor you for having to break the ice for the world on some of these subjects that are no longer taboo. I mean, you can see that the 16-year-olds are all about this kind of stuff. And we're excited to, what I call dragnet some of your science, so that the scientists, you guys, we don't know how to do, you know, like measured research, but we can at least get started with some of these things, the ham radios with our bodies, so that you guys can really do the papers on it. And we're excited that you've inspired us to do that. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, you know, you say that meditate, you know, you did a study on 1,000 meditators, and I was just like so shocked when I read the results. You said that 3/4 of them increased their synchronicities, half of them communicated with non-human entities, and 1/3 of them were you know, experiencing telepathy. So I wanted to ask you, like, the nitty-gritty of what your meditation practice looks like.
Well, I've done many different methods over the years. First time I learned how to do meditation was through TM in 1970, when I was a freshman in college. And I had very dramatic and somewhat frightening experiences very quickly. And the people at the time who were teaching TM, they were like 1 month ahead of me, so they didn't really know. You know, we had no gurus around. We had people who had been meditating for 1 week longer than you had. So I after about 6 months, I dropped it because I didn't know what was going on. In hindsight, what was happening is that I was beginning to break old habits, essentially, have ways of seeing and ways of being, but no one mentioned that this is the kind of thing that can happen, that you're breaking up habits. So years would go by, and then I would learn Vipassana, and then more recently I've been doing a Shaktipat meditation and many different yogic styles. And so I've been I would say a kind of a dilettante in trying many different methods. The one that seems to work the best for me is Vipassana, mainly because I'm in my head most of the time, and that's what science is about. You're doing stuff in your head. So Vipassana is a way for me to quiet it down and make the noises stop. So that's what I do.
So that's where you just like stay in silence for a number of days in a row. Is that correct? And if so, are you getting downloads, or you get downloads while you work all day and you just want to clear your mind? How is it?
No, Vipassana you can do in 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 40 minutes a day.
Oh,
It's in today's vernacular, it's very similar to mindfulness meditation. So you simply become passive and watch thoughts flow. And if you do that long enough, the thoughts begin to go away and you end up with emptiness. So the goal, in a sense, is to become extremely still and quiet inside, which for me, that's complete opposite of my normal state. Mm-hmm. So when I get a download, it's almost always through dreams, because I don't remember my dreams too much. But if I do remember a dream, I pay very close attention to it. And if it's a dream, if I'm working on a problem, I will oftentimes get what seems like a solution, or at least an answer, in the dream. And if I then actually act on it, and these are usually analytical things having to do with processing data, it's almost always right. So this is good. It's a way of jumpstarting working on a problem. It's not so good from the point of view from a scientific perspective, because the goal in science is to find out what's true that is not part of you, like what's objectively true. And the moment that you start bringing your own ideas especially into analysis or experiments, you can begin to see that a large chunk of science is very similar to the discipline or the traditions about affirmations. Like I have a hypothesis. I want to show that this hypothesis is true. Spend a lot of time thinking about it, being very clear about what the result is going to be. And we do experiments, we do analyses. More often than not, we get the results that we wanted. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It just means we somehow shape the world in such a way to get what we want, which is exactly what you do with affirmations. So I've seen this happen so many times that I'm always second guessing. If I do an experiment, I get a result and it looks like amazingly good, you start looking for a way, well, how could this not be what I think it is? So there's a lot of self-doubt, self-criticism that's required in science. And it's not difficult, just after a while you get used to it because you anticipate what your colleagues will say, well, did you think of this? And did you think of that? Well, you have to be one step ahead and think of everything. That's part of the fun though.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. I'm glad you're the one doing the rigorous science. I'm just like, oh, we proved we did it. And I'm excited about that. But you're right. You're right. I'm glad that you're viewing it from all angles. So what do you think happens when you dream? Like, where are you? Like, how are you getting those downloads from your dreams? Where are you? Where do you go?
Well, it's probably a big mishmash. It's a combination of things that happen during the day. And if you've been watching TV before you go to sleep, some of it is replaying that. Some of it is different, feels different, which is information coming from who knows where. I've learned to be able to pay attention to that. It feels different, even in a dream. And that's what I tend to remember when I wake up. And almost always it has to do with either an experiment that I'm working on or one that I should do that I haven't done yet. And the thing is, if I get it in a dream, I know it's going to work. Like, that's the word noetic means a kind of intuition where you have certainty that it's true. And so I get those dreams and then I'll do the experiment. And sure enough, it works just the way that I thought it would work. But again, when you put on your skeptical hat, you're thinking, well, am I pulling down knowledge from the universe or am I creating this effect? Very difficult to be able to discriminate between those two possibilities. Because if you're creating the effect, that means that the universe is not anywhere near as stable as we think it is. It's, we're constantly creating it, recreating it. When you see that happen again and again from an experimental point of view, it becomes more and more difficult to simply set aside the idea that affirmations are real. It really works. That what I just said, you will get no scientist to ever admit that in public because it's not supposed to be the way that the world works. And yet sometimes that seems to be the case.
Yeah, which really begs the question, if we go deeper into what you were just saying, it begs the question, you have this theory, this C equals C, your personal consciousness equals universal consciousness. So maybe you can never achieve what you just said you wanted to achieve. You can never not be observing, controlling, creating your reality. So when you do that experiment, you are the one believing that the hypothesis, but you're also the one believing that you need to come at it another, like there's no escaping that. Like how do you, you have some theories about the way reality works. And one of them is that, there is only one consciousness. So what is that? Like, how do you make sense of that? Is it that we're all having a unique, complete copy of the universe, and yet we're, or do you think, how do you deal with that profound and weird situation?
Well, this is why I'm not a philosopher, because you need to be able to think a certain way in abstract terms in order to be able to think about it without your head exploding. And so I'm an empiricist. I take ideas and figure out a way to test the ideas. When I wrote the book Real Magic, I was trying to cover the entire scope of, is there evidence, and if there is, and how do we begin to understand it? And when you do that, you need to look at the esoteric traditions from a philosophical point of view and decide, well, what is the worldview that these traditions are telling us about? And it's very clear that worldview is consciousness is fundamental. That means it is more fundamental than the physical world. The physical world emerges somehow out of consciousness. Given that we're at least partially physical creatures that have some kind of consciousness, we're self-aware, it becomes extremely difficult. We cannot step outside of where and who we are. You kind of need, like you need to jump out of the universe and look back on it. Well, we don't know how to do that yet. So we do the best that we can. And the main approach that we then take in studying things like psychic phenomena is some of these phenomena you can study in the lab pretty well. You can show that they exist. And about the best we can do at this point is demonstrate that the prevailing ideas about mind and brain are probably wrong. Which is a big step forward already, right? So from a neuroscience perspective, the dogma is that everything you are, your memories, your awareness, your history, your behavior, all of that is as the result of activity in the brain. That's it. You are your brain. And you see a lot of books with that kind of title, You and Your Brain. Well, some of that is correct. Our brain very clearly is involved in the way that we experience reality. You can trace the circuits in the brain. You can see how it is that vision and sound and everything are processed in the brain. It's like a computing machine almost. But it doesn't tell us anything about the internal sense of awareness. How if we bite into a lemon, we have an experience of that lemon. You never can trace from the outside where that experience comes from. Like there's no correlate to that at all. So where does it come from? Well, that's why more and more scientists are beginning to think that there's some inherent property in the fabric of reality that simply has the awareness of awareness. It is awareness, right? So from the esoteric tradition, somebody figured that out as from a philosophical point of view a long time ago. And so they decided that maybe all there really is, and everything that you will ever know comes through your experience, through your awareness, and everything else is an inference. So all that means all of our science is basically an inference based on our awareness. So a philosopher would say this is idealism. In the esoteric worlds, they would use different words, but basically that's it. So if all of that were true and the physical world emerges from consciousness, which is simply some kind of primordial something in the background of the universe, then the idea of magic and psychic phenomena and all these things become actually quite easy to understand. Because if the universe emerges from consciousness with a large C, and we have a little bit of that in ourselves, we have like a little c that is associated with us, then we have the same creative power that the entire universe has. So if I think very carefully about something and I want it to occur, I can make that happen. I'm creating a universe, or at least a little tiny piece of the universe. The reason it doesn't happen like we see in movies is because you're not the only one doing this. You're at least on this planet with another 8 billion people who have that capacity too. And so you're in a gigantic competition with lots of other people who also are creating their universe. And so there have to be some degree of compatibility, because if you have two people thinking totally opposite things, it could be the equivalent of an annihilation, that either neither of them would work or they would cancel each other out. So that's all from a magical worldview. The scientific worldview of materialism is also correct, right? We can't throw away the textbooks because they work too well. This technology that we're using right now is based completely on materialistic notions, and it works. So that has led me somewhat away from pure idealism and more into a philosophy of dual aspect monism. So dual aspect monism says consciousness is definitely a real thing. Matter and energy are also real things. They both emerge out of something else, right? That's what monism is about. There's really just one thing that has no name, because whatever that is, it gives rise to two aspects, dual aspects of reality as best as we can understand and experience it at this point. So if a mystic goes into that state, they come back and they immediately say, I cannot describe to you what I just experienced, because there are no words, no concepts even, that can be used to describe this underlying condition where it's before consciousness and before matter and energy. It's there, but it's not part of our language, so there's no way to even talk about it. So that's the model that I currently use. And the model is useful because a lot of the research that I do is looking at the relationship between consciousness and matter, mind-matter interaction, psychokinetic effects. It's extremely difficult to understand how that works from a materialistic perspective. It's also kind of difficult to figure out from an idealist perspective, because in idealism, essentially there is no physical world. It's all like a construct. So you need both somehow, and then look at the interactions between them. And we see effects. So this is my working hypothesis. That's about as close as I get.
Very cool. So do you think, now we were getting into this sort of line of thinking when we were interviewing Adam Curry, do you think that there's a possibility that the apple could also be conscious? The spoon, the entire environment that we're seeped in is also conscious. And I know you know, I read something that you're wondering if machines could do better magic than us. So what do you think about all that?
Well, the panpsychist view is that everything has awareness. It's an inherent property of existence. Even electrons, atoms, everything has a kind of an awareness. We have an awareness that we understand because we have an intimate feeling of it. But yeah, from a panpsychist perspective, everything has an awareness. Yeah, and then by that token, everything has the same creative ability as the entire universe has, to the degree to which it can use it. Again, language is beginning to fail here, but there's something about being able to go into states, like a magician would go into a state of gnosis, or a yogi would go into a state of samadhi. From that deep state, you're able to use the creative power to a greater extent than you would in an everyday awareness, or that a plant, which may be aware, but it can't use the awareness in the same way.
Do you mean your ability to create a reality, or your just awareness of how the system works in order to, okay.
Both.
So one of the things you teach in your recent book is how to do force of will magic or manifestation. And you say, number one, you have to know what you want. You have to have an intention. Number two, you have to hold on to that attention. So, you know, put it in your, computer, so you're seeing it all the time. Number three, keep it secret. And this is important because you say what you're doing, it sounds like that's not possible, and all of a sudden you've crashed it. And then also to be gratitude. So my question to you is, do you use this in your life? Like, have you manifested grants? And like, what have you done in that way?
Well, I think so. Actually, I know so. It's just that well, I'll give you an example of the way that, so sometimes I use this idea of, let's say you wanted to do affirmations to make a gold-plated Mercedes show up in your driveway. So, every time you think about something, even in a casual sense, I believe that it is pushing probabilities of the world around. Think of now versus tomorrow. There's a million, like a big branching probabilistic structure that gets us from here to there. Lots of decisions are being made along the way. If you're able to navigate through that branching structure in an intelligent way, where you know what's happening, you can like feel the future effects, you can navigate yourself into a place where all kinds of miraculous things are happening. If you're doing it blindly, then who knows where you're going to end up? You'll end up somewhere by chance. So if you want the gold-plated Mercedes to show up, it's almost as though the process of focusing on that allows you to feel through this branching structure just slightly better than chance, and are able to navigate through it. So I was using this example once in a webinar, and a person heard it and said, well, you probably could get a gold-plated Mercedes. And sure enough, in the mail shows up this. This is a gold-plated Mercedes. It's actually, it's a little car that's a Mercedes. The doors open and the wheels turn and everything, and it's gold. And so I wrote back and said, that this is a great thing, thank you. And she said, well, it's just as an illustration that if you're not completely clear on what it is that you want, you can get a gold-plated Mercedes, but that's not exactly what I had in mind, right? So this was like the first step of having extremely clear statement of what it is that you think you want. And in addition, provided that it's not going to override anybody else's intention or affirmations. So if I make a gold-plated actual Mercedes show up in my driveway, somebody else is going to be missing one probably, right? They don't just fall out of the sky, or maybe it could be an airplane that's taking one somewhere and it literally falls out of the airplane, but it's not mine, right? Just because it fell into my yard, it doesn't mean it belongs to me. So the clarity of the intention is very important. So so this is the one example. I have my gold-plated Mercedes. The other one, which is much more, it happens more often in my life, is that some years ago, around 10 years ago, we were doing an experiment where we're testing in long-term meditators. Sometimes they report that they get into a state of spaciousness where they feel like their feeling of space begins to expand, but also timelessness, that the movement of time also begins to expand. And so we worked with people who had a daily practice for over 20 years of a non-dual form of meditation. These are things like Zen and Dzogchen and a couple of other methods like that. So, and we had controls as well who had never meditated, the same gender and age. And so the experiment was very simple. We were taking 32 channels of EEG while presenting very simple stimuli to them, either a little light flash that they would see or they hear an audio tone. And the idea of this kind of experiment is that they're not trying to outguess what the future is. They simply were looking at their brain to see if their brain would respond in advance of a light flash or an audio tone. And when you have a light flash, the occipital lobe of the brain is responding, and audio tone, the audio cortex. So we figured that maybe if that portion of the brain responded in advance to a randomly selected future event, that would show that their claim of timelessness is true. They really are extended in time. So we were preparing to do this, and we had the EEG system, and I got funding to do the experiment, and I'm thinking, I can do the analysis, but what I really want is somebody who is an expert in this kind of analysis, like somebody who really does computational neuroscience and is a master of this. Well, it turns out that one of the packages that is both free and one of the most comprehensive EEG analysis packages is called EEG Lab. And so you use MATLAB and use a few other things, you download it, and it's a complicated but very comprehensive system. So I was telling my research assistant, I really don't want to have to learn this. Like I want to get like a grad student or somebody who knows how to use this and maybe get them to do it. So she said, is that what you really want? You want a grad student to do this? What do you really want? And so it forced me to think in detail, what do I really want? I said, I want someone to come to the lab who is like the world's expert in this to help us. 1 week later, I'm contacted by Arnaud Delorme, who now works at IONS, who is the developer of EEG Lab. So he is literally the world's expert in that package because he wrote it. And he was fascinated by the idea of our experiment and ended up becoming part of the ION staff, along with his other appointments at UCSD and at a university in France. And he did an analysis of the type that I would never have been able to do because he knows it. He knows how to do those analyses at the level of top tier science. So this is an example of, for me, it really brought home the idea that I need to know exactly what it is that I want. And once I get that, once it's really clear, almost always within a week or a month, whatever that thing was, I will get it. Regardless of how ridiculous it might seem beforehand, but nevertheless, it happens.
So I'm a little bit confused about the when you were talking about the tree of probabilities of like that Mercedes coming in, and like obviously it's easier to manifest something that is probabilistic, more likely, right? Obviously, but what do you mean, like like you were saying, navigate through the probability tree to get that? What do you mean?
It depends on how you think about the future. So is the future fated? We live in a deterministic universe, and there is nothing you can do to prevent what's going to happen a month from now. Well, I've done experiments on this issue as to whether the future is probabilistic or determined. And all the experiments I've run suggest that when we get a feeling about the future, it is the probable future right now. It is not the future as it's going to be. It is the most probable thing that is going to happen now. If that is true, and I think that is probably the case, then we don't live in a deterministic universe and we have free will. We can choose things. So think now of what you're doing this time next month. So you can make predictions about what's likely to happen, but between now and then, there's a whole bunch of things that could happen. Yeah, an asteroid could hit the planet, who knows? So you then think of right this moment as the beginning of a tree of probabilities. Mm-hmm. Like this could happen, that could happen. And then once that happens, that could happen and that could, so you very quickly branch out into an enormous number of possibilities, some of which are much more likely than others. So, but because there's this decision tree that's happening all along the way, if you're not aware of the decisions that you're making, you're going to more or less move through this probabilistic structure through whatever the strongest current is. So the metaphor I use is like we're all floating on a stream that has a certain very strong current in it. And if you're on a little boat in that stream and you're not trying to do anything, you're going to be dragged along with the current. And the current happens to be going over a waterfall, you're going to go over a waterfall. If you're able to think about this as more of a probabilistic state, then you have a little paddle in your boat and you can sense that you don't want to go over the waterfall over there. Well, you start paddling and you can slowly pull yourself out of the mainstream, literally, and cause yourself to end up somewhere else. Well, that requires a certain degree of awareness of where you are and where you're likely to end up. So I think what affirmations are doing is forcing you to pay attention to each decision along the way and steering yourself into the future that you actually want, because it's not fixed. What this model does not tell us, though, is each individual making decisions have their own branching structure. And so we're all getting pulled along a stream, and we can't completely get off of the stream because it's simply too big and has too much inertia, but we can use like a trim tab and decide where we want to end up on that stream in more positive or more negative ways, depending on what it is that you wish to do.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk about this, you and someone else manifesting something together. And to this day, like I read it the other day out loud to someone and I was literally crying. I was laughing so hard. You were working for Paul Allen, the founder of Microsoft, doing research. You're setting up your lab. You were like, I wish we had even more money because I put this there, this there, this there. And then this other guy next door was doing Tibetan meditate, dream meditation, and he wanted to somehow attract you in his life so you could be on his board. And you walked into his lab one day and you're like, oh my God, his lab was set up exactly how you wanted your lab to set up. And he was like, you're here next door. Like, and you talked about that in terms of synchronicity. What is synchronicity? How do you understand it? What is it?
Well, when we do a psi experiment, it's an exercise in controlled synchronicity. So synchronicity is usually, the classic description is a meaningful coincidence. So you could, the synchronicity that they talk about in real magic could be looked at as a coincidence. It's like a funny thing happened that we ended up right next to each other in an impossible way. Well, maybe it's not so coincidental, right? We were both involved in very strong intentional practice at the time. I was envisioning what I wanted. He was envisioning what he wanted, which was me. And maybe that acts in a metaphorical way as a kind of a gravity, right? We were pulling each other into each other's orbits. And oftentimes the synchronicity becomes most meaningful when things collide, right? The synchronicity is you meet a friend that you haven't seen in 20 years in the middle of nowhere. Well, how does that happen? And you were just thinking about them. Well, it's almost as though we think that we have free will and we think we're making decisions all the time that we're making, maybe not so much, that we're also being influenced by other people's intentions. So if two people happen to be thinking a lot about each other for whatever reason, it's as though their orbits are getting pulled together and eventually they're going to collide. And usually it's a happy collision. It's like, oh, what a strange coincidence. So I've heard stories of people who were on the road and they didn't have a cell phone and they desperately needed to contact somebody. So they stop at a gas station and they couldn't remember the number of the person they needed to call, because who remembers numbers anymore? And they just hit numbers on the phone, it rings, and that's the person. So that's like, well, did they pull it out of their unconscious? Is that where they got it? And they would claim, well, I don't know. It's a coincidence. I just like randomly hit numbers, and then they answered the phone, the person who I was wanting to call. Well, in each of these cases, you can make up stories, like we know much more than we know consciously. We're able to go out and grab information and use it in some way, or it came out of the unconscious because you simply weren't aware that you knew the number. Lots of things like that. So we ultimately don't know an explanation for why these things occur, but that they do occur, and even that you can create them when you really need it to happen. Well, it's one of those mysteries that we're trying to understand. So when we do a controlled experiment in the laboratory, we are evoking a synchronicity in the lab. So we can make it happen on demand. It just doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah. So we're going to go into breakout groups right now. If you want, you can stay into the main session. If you go into a breakout groups, remember to have one person be the timer, 5 minutes each person. You can talk about the synchronicities that have happened in your life, or what you're manifesting for 2022, or you can also ask for support that you need in your life. And we will be back. So Dean, don't accept the breakout group because you're going to stay in here with the recording with me. So I'm going to go ahead and start those. And so what is your main curiosity, Dean? Like, I also want to give a shout out. I see Mark Simzak is here from Sedona Quantum Consciousness, our sponsor for tonight. And I just wanted to give a shout out to you. I hope you're having fun on your vacation, Mark. So, what is your burning curiosity right now in your research? Like, what if you had a ton of money and all the money that you would want, what are you most curious about?
Well, I have usually around 15 projects going in any given time. So if I had a lot of money, I would hire assistants, because I mean, I can do all of these projects, but it's one person can only go so fast. So I would hire a bunch of people to be able to offload ideas, I think, that are worth following up. The other thing is, if I had a huge amount of money, I would start endowing chairs for consciousness studies at universities around the world. And the reason is that there's me and there's about 100 colleagues like myself around the world who are doing this sort of research, that have a scientific bent and training. No one's going to make a breakthrough that's going to change the taboo that prevents this from becoming mainstream if 100 people are working on it with virtually no money. So given that virtually everybody in the world is interested in these kinds of things, including scientists, why is it not in the academic world? So there's 15,000 institutions of higher learning around the world, and only 40 of them have at least one faculty member who's known for having an interest, not even an active interest, but any interest in this. What that tells us is when 99.7% of academia does not even have one person known for having an interest in a topic, there's a taboo that is preventing it from being talked about. Well, one of the ways of breaking a taboo is to reduce the charge of the taboo. And the way that this was done in the UK was that Arthur Koestler, the author, he left a bequeathment of £500,000 to a university that would endow a chair of parapsychology. So the University of Edinburgh accepted the money because they already had a faculty member who was known for this thing, and the universe did not end. So they created a chair, and the holder of that chair is named Bob Morris. And through his tenure, there were about 75 doctorates that were given. That has made the UK the world center for academic parapsychology. And it took one person in one university to figure out how to do that. That could be replicated everywhere, because one of the strategies that Bob did, which you could do in the UK, it'd be more difficult elsewhere, is he went to every single university psychology department and gave a talk. And his style was one of a very calm and non-threatening, straightforward academic, like, here's experiences that people have. We can study them. Here's some interesting results. We need to maintain skepticism, of course, but, isn't this interesting? He did that for something like 200 departments, every single one of university level in the entire UK. Later, it turned out that he changed the way that people think about this topic within the academic system, because what most people know in academia is essentially a meme, and the meme is incorrect. The meme says, oh, this stuff is just fraud and it's not real and all that, and so you can ignore it. Well, Bob was very effective in saying, no, that meme is actually not correct. There's all kinds of interesting things. So imagine a billionaire comes along and spends the $50 or $100 million to endow chairs that are devoted to this kind of study. Well, there was such a chair devoted at Harvard University about 100 years ago, which very rapidly was gobbled up by the psych department and the money went away. There was another chair at Stanford University, which after the first person who held the chair, no one ever again held that chair because the psych department siphoned away the money. So when you create an endowment, you have to be extremely clear about what the purpose of the endowment is, and you need to build in a way so that it doesn't get diluted over time. It's not easy to do that, but you can do it. And by in one shot creating a worldwide discipline, if you have 50 endowed chairs, that becomes a discipline. That would mean that we now have thousands of people working on these topics, which is what you need in order to really make significant advances. So for the billionaires who are on this call, this is how I would spend your money. It's not what I personally would do. I have my own ideas about what I would do, but that's not going to advance the state of the art that much. One person can't do that much, but 1,000 can.
That's beautiful. Well, let's put our force of will magic to that task for the next 4 years. Because, like you said, it is like the curiosity about your work is absolutely now becoming not as taboo. And so now is really the floodgates. And like you said, everyone's curious about this. It's just, we have to find the money to put the researchers on. And that's why, LightNet, what we're building is kind of doing it, the citizen science route, because there's a lot of smart people who are retired that have a lot of time on their hands, or there's, young college kids who have a lot of time on their hands and can do these experiments. My friend Adrian got my son one of these, because I was telling him all about your experiments. So what are things that we can do as citizen science that are, and again, the platform is going to help us track the results and show the results. But what would you task would you put us to? What experiments do you think would be applicable for us?
Well, so you probably have heard of the Global Consciousness Project.
Mm-hmm.
So we're currently working on what we're calling GCP 2.0 now. The original project, which is still running, had at its peak around 75 random number generators, but the project was never intended as an intentional target. It was a passive, it was observing the world mind passively because we didn't want to interfere with it. But the new version will have parallel random streams. So we're planning on at least 1,000 random generators. So we have a much higher density of information. But more importantly, each one of the nodes, each random generator will have multiple random streams in them. Some of them are set aside for intentional experiments. So at some point, we will, in our website that's being developed now, we will allow groups who want to target the world to do so and to use the data that's being returned in order to see if that actually makes an effect. So that's perfect for groups. The other thing is that the same infrastructure will allow us to do worldwide games. So we figure that people like competition games and cooperation games. So imagine that we do a cooperation game where what you see on your screen is a maze, and your job is to move the ball through the maze. It's not a complex maze, but nevertheless, you have to move it. Well, how do you move it? Well, everybody in North America has to move the x-axis of a little ball. Everybody in Europe has to move the vertical axis. And together, we need to move the x and y axis in such a way to make the ball move through the thing. So this is a cooperation game. The movement of the balls would depend on the way that the random number generators are responding. So in a competition game, you could have the equivalent of Pong, that half of the world have one paddle and half of the world can have another paddle, and they're controlling the paddles of the game. So there are lots of variations that we're going to build into this thing, which make it partially game-like, but actually is doing a worldwide test of the role of intention in the physical world. So that's one way. That's one large-scale project that we're doing, which should be fun.
Yeah, well, we'll have to call up Roger and get him on the show in March.
Yeah. And Roger is, of course, a key player in this thing. And the other people are Roland McCready at HeartMath. So we're all working as a team now to build this, both the infrastructure and the data analysis and all of those aspects that are part of the experiment.
And then I just have to get Adam Curry to get his app working, the Entangled app. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, we've been waiting forever for that to work, and I guess it's more complicated than he originally thought.
Yeah. So I can't do anything, like if I don't have the cameras to do the analysis on two of these entanglement, I can't do it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need a webcam to look at it and be able.
Explain a little bit for the audience what how that experiment worked.
So you set up a plasma ball, you set up a webcam looking at the plasma ball. The plasma streams in one of these balls is exquisitely sensitive to local electric fields. Because that's, among other things, plasma has a huge amount of electrons in it, so it doesn't take much to make them flip around. And they're flipping all the time, which is why they're fun to look at. So I used that as a target in a intentional experiment where the computer would speak the instruction. So for a 30-second period, the computer would initially say, now aim right, which means now make the streamers go to the right, just through your intention. And you'd see on the computer a graph that is showing the amount of illumination that it's seeing going to the right. And then it would say, okay, now relax. So you withdraw your attention, you're not getting any feedback on the screen. And generally you don't see the ball. In fact, when we do this experiment in the most rigorous way, the ball is inside our electromagnetically shielded room and all by itself, it's sealed in there. So you don't never get to actually see it, but you know where it is. And then it might say, okay, now think up, make the streamers go up, now think left, and so on. And in each case, the webcam is taking pictures, typically around 10 to 30 pictures per second, and analyzing what it is that it's seeing and matching it against whether or not are the streamers actually going to the right? Are they going up? Well, the answer is yes. Even under the most rigorous conditions that we were able to create, where the ball was by itself in the shielded room, the ball was responding to intention. So, there's, as with any experiment, all it does is add a whole bunch of new questions. Like, well, what happened? Was there an electric field effect or a magnetic field, or what else can we begin to look at to figure out why it was working? Well, we never got that far with this. We were only at the stage where we're seeing whether the streamers would move at all. And they apparently do. And so as a rather simple physical target to work with, it's a good one. And it's not that difficult to set up a webcam and write a simple program to look at it all, unless you're not a computer scientist, and then it becomes difficult. But in principle, I have an assistant who's a computer person, and I tell them do this, this, and this, and they would make a package, and then just anybody who wanted to download that package would get it, and they would just buy the ball itself for, I don't know, it cost maybe $30. And so each individual will be able to have a little PK experiment that they can play with.
So cool. So cool. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you that I'm really curious about is what research have you done with channeling, especially non-human entities, and what do you think that is? Do you think that when you're interacting with non-human entities, do you think those are within our consciousness? Are we creating that in our consciousness, or are they somehow outside of base reality and are literally interacting with us from somewhere else?
I have no idea. So the one experiment they did with channeling, we've done several at IONS, but I've only participated in one directly. Was 5 channelers at the same time. The channelers are working with, all of them are working with what they perceive as aliens from other galaxies. There's no way to vet the information, right? So when you ask questions like, well, how do you interpret this? The answer is, I have no idea. The channelers have no idea either. Nobody has any idea. So if somebody's saying, I'm so-and-so from the Pleiades, and this is what I have to share with you, what we can do is say, well, okay, that's interesting. What is the channeler's brain doing while they're doing that, right? That's something we can measure. In those experiments, we used a new kind of random number generator that we built to kind of measure the background while they're doing this. So we saw, while the channeling was taking place, we saw negentropic changes in the randomness. But that may have nothing to do with non-human entities. It may have everything to do with the fact that there was focused attention, which seems to be the thing that causes this negentropic effect. But beyond that, I don't know what to do with it. It's much, much easier to do experiments with mediums. So the mediums are presumably working with departed human entities, but there you can verify that the information that they're getting is correct. Even though we don't know how they're getting the information, it's correct. But when it comes to aliens or non-human fill in the blank, we don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because, a lot of people will channel Metatron or Melchizedek all over the world. You know what I mean? So it's like,
yeah.
Are they tapping into some sort of a knowledge base that is that consciousness, or what? Have you ever had any experience where you're interacting with a loved one, a dead person, or an angel, or something that is, or do you just interact with your higher self? Or
no, that's, each of us have different skills. That is not one of my skills.
Yeah. And when you said that you sometimes get your information when you're dreaming, that's just more like a thought, like you're like, oh, I need to try this formula in this way. It's not, or is it more like visual, like you see the golden Cadillac or the golden Mercedes?
In the dream, it's often visual, but when I wake up, of course, it's a memory. Mm-hmm. So the memory part of it is, how do I describe it? If it's an analytical thing that I'm working on, then it's an idea. oh, try this thing, which is somewhere between a mathematical idea or just a conceptual idea. It's not an image. Sometimes I'll get a full-blown design of an experiment, which includes equipment, the way to do it, like all aspects of the whole thing, just in one big download. That's more rare than getting an answer to some kind of a technical question that I've been working on during the day.
Yeah. So, when you did the Got stuff online, and was there anything surprising on that? That was pretty addictive. Are you guys doing that anymore? What's happening?
Well, the new version will be out in the new year.
Oh, yes.
We've revamped the whole thing because I wrote that initially in 2000, and it was state of the art in 2000, but the world has moved on, and it's been remarkably stable. Like, we didn't change anything really for 19 years, but eventually some of the mechanisms underneath it have changed because standards on the internet have changed, like the use of cookies and stuff. So the new version will work in Java and other methods, which are now very mainstream. And we have a full-blown database behind it, and it's much faster and much cleaner both from the user's perspective and from the back-end perspective with the data. So I have looked at it, and we have found a number of interesting things. The first thing is that whenever you do an online experiment, at least half to 3/4 of the data is useless, because first of all, you never know who's actually using it. It could be a cat hitting the keyboard. And you don't know if the person is doing the experiment in a frivolous way or for fun, or they're seriously trying it. It's very difficult to know. So you have to get a huge amount of data to get through all of that noise. And sometimes you can figure out if somebody is doing it just frivolously, because they'll just keep hitting the same thing over and over again. Once you can get rid of the bad data, you begin to see interesting things. So I had mentioned before that one of the topics that we're interested in is, what is the nature of the future? Is it fixed or is it probable? So one of the Got tests is a card test. You would see the back of 5 cards, you'd have to select one, and then you would see if you're right. So from the surface, it looks like each of these is equally probable, and you're just trying to guess which one it is. On that task, you don't get statistically significant results overall. So if you're only interested in, can people do the card game? The answer is no, they can't. It's like, oh, it's a complete wash. But that's why I knew that from the get-go, and I built in a hidden task, which is the one that's really of interest. And this is true in most of these games. There's a hidden element in it that you don't tell people about. And even if you did tell people, like I'm telling you now, it's not going to help you, because you'd still be able to do the task. So the way the card game actually works is, it is as though you have 5 cards, but the probabilities of each card of actually turning into the future target is different. So I have 5 cards. I'll say, okay, the computer will assign one of the cards a 90% probability of being the future target. And the others will be 10% divided by 4. So the others will have the remaining probabilities. So you have 1 very likely target and 4 that are very unlikely to occur. The decision then is that you're going to click on one of these things and trying to guess which one is going to be the future target. From your perspective, they're all equal, but they're really not. So the question is, are you attracted to the most likely thing that's going to happen, namely the 90% card? Or are you going to select the card that's going to happen independent of its probability? Because if the future is determined and precognition sees the determined future, then the probabilities in the present don't matter, because something is going to happen in the future, and occasionally it's going to be a very low probability event from the future, from the present perspective, but it happens anyway. So if it turns out that people doing this experiment over and over again, there are a lot of instances, like we have 250 million trials on this, because a lot of people, so we have a huge database. So you can ask questions like, on those occasions when a very low probability event did occur, are people actually getting it? And so we have an answer to that question. The answer is no. What they're doing is they're being attracted to the most likely outcome in the present. So there's something about precognition, at least in that simple game-like context, where unbeknownst to what people are doing, they are actually being attracted to the most likely event in the future. In this case, the future is only like a fraction of a second after they press the button, but it's a true random selection at that point. And we're doing similar kinds of things with the other games as well to answer questions about the nature of what it is that the psychic eye sees. And also questions about what is the future? Is it fixed? Is it probable? All those kinds of things we're building into the process. So one other thing that we found a lot of things, but one that I'll mention is one of the games is like a dowsing task. So you have a space and you have to click a spot where you think the computer will randomly select a spot. And then we can look at the distance apart. So dowsing has to do with orientation. It's like your feeling of, I think it's kind of over there, I think it's kind of here. And orientation is strongly influenced by a variety of external factors, like the geomagnetic field, the lunar phase, things of that sort. So we did an analysis on the results of what we call the location task, which is kind of a dowsing task, in correlation with the geomagnetic field. We have 20 years of data, so we know what it is every single day. We know how people behaved every day. Find a strong correlation that during days of noisy geomagnetic data, where magnetic fields going all over the place, people's ability to do this dowsing task is reduced. Yeah. So, this is yet like another correlate of looking at what is causing performance to change in these kinds of tests. And so the one other I'll mention is in one of the remote viewing tasks, people enter words for what they think the future target is going to be, what the image is going to be. So this was way back when, just before 9/11, I was tracking what the words were. And we noticed that within a day and hours of 9/11 unfolding, we started to see a lot of words having to do with violence, with terrorism, with crashes, with things, those kinds of words were people spontaneously using to describe the remote viewing target that they were about to see, which had nothing to do with 9/11. It was just pictures, but almost as though the imagery was arising in people's minds. And rather than seeing words which were associated with terrorism, it was actually the opposite. We saw a deficit. We saw those kinds of words began to disappear, almost as though collectively, psychically, we felt that something horrific was about to happen, and we censored that. And so the words that people were using, suddenly all those kinds of imagery and sentiment began to disappear. So this was unexpected. We didn't think that was going to happen. We actually expected the opposite was going to happen, that people would feel these things and then start reporting it. But the opposite is true. When people start getting a sense of something bad about to occur, then they start censoring it. And so they didn't put those words in there anymore. So I've been paying attention to this on Twitter and a few other places where there's an enormous number of words. And we find similar effects, that just before horrific things unfold, you begin to see a deficit of sentiment, which is still useful. You can use it to help predict things. Like I did an analysis of words before that horrible shooting in Las Vegas, where somebody was in one of the casinos and shot a whole bunch of people in Las Vegas. So I got all of not all, but some of the Twitter feed at that time, and was able to show that there is a change in the sentiment just before that unfolded. So it's possible we might be able to someday use it as a kind of predictor that something's going to happen. And you would need something like Twitter with the level of density that it covers around the world in order to be able to localize it. Because if you got an alarm that something bad's going to happen, but you don't know where and you don't know what, law enforcement can't do anything. So we're trying to figure out how do we get a degree of specificity so we can tell somebody, and there are people who are watching, go here at this time and something's going to happen, even if we don't know what it is. So we're not able to do that yet.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, you could just get the meditators on it. But I wonder if the opposite is true. We're going to go to questions. I also want to show the surveys. But Roger Nelson's work did show, right, that like, because I know that when you guys would show people pictures on, gear, it was like a 7-second precognition, but then 9/11 was a much huger window. Like we're talking hours, right? So that's going to be interesting to see the time dilation, how that I do feel like we know that we don't understand time. And speaking of time, this was so interesting. So when we ask people, what do you feel is the two most important things to do in manifesting or force of will magic? Intention was high, but then time travel was the second one.
Yeah.
Being grateful, belief was down a little bit. And we didn't get a very big spread here. So the question that we asked earlier in this interview, when people channel non-human entities, are they communicating outside of their personal consciousness, or are they communicating with a version of their higher self?
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. Enlightenment is when you're one with everything. You realize you create your reality. You see that love is the core lesson. You realize we're in some sort of a dream. And I'm going to put the results here in the chat and also in the archives so that you can read some of these things here. So I'd like to open it up to the members to ask any questions. Hello, Nadi. She's also one of our consortium leads. So welcome. Does anybody have a question? If so, you can go ahead and raise your hand or also type it in the chat. I'm also going to share Dean's links in the chat now, and also the results. While we're seeing if anybody has any questions, so again, you can raise your hand on the reactions tab. So how far of a stretch do you think you can look into the future, but the probabilities are going to be more murky the further out you go? Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
the world a nanosecond from now will be pretty much the way it is right now. The world a year from now will be very different.
We should go check and see if there's a gold-plated Mercedes in your yard, though.
Well, no, but see, in that sense, I actually wouldn't want it to show up, because you're gonna have to answer to somebody, well, where did you get this? Why do you want that? And not only that, who wants something that's that valuable to drive around? I mean, it gets stolen. So I'm very happy to have this one. This is a nice version of it.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to steal that.
Yeah. There's a famous, Joe Dispenza's daughter manifested a shopping spree once in a mall. That was what she chose to manifest. And this guy came up to her and her friend, said, "I own this entire mall. Come back here. Here's a credit card." And she was like, "Is there a limit to how much we can spend?" And he's like, "No." She spent $15,000 in one day. There you go. Hey, Mark, go ahead and ask your question of Dr. Radin.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Zenka and
Oh,
Dr.
wait,
Radin.
actually, we have two Marks on the call, and both of them have questions. Sorry, I went ahead and pinned. So, Mark, you're next. Sorry about that. We've got Mark Schneider first. Can you hear us, Mark? Go ahead.
Okay. Some scientists today say that creating our reality is a matter of directing our consciousness, and the quantum field organizes events to materialize our intentions. How would you explain a self-manifested reality?
Well, as I was saying earlier, that if you imagine that an idealistic worldview where from consciousness, the physical world emerges, then each of us has some of that ability. So we can cause things to happen in the same way that some universal consciousness can cause the universe to happen. That's not really an explanation down into the weeds, like we don't have the mechanisms at each stage along the way, but that is the esoteric worldview, that something like that seems to be happening when we do experiments, psychokinetic type of experiments. We're working on underlying mechanisms, but the problem is that mechanism works really well for physical systems. Like we know how to do that. We know how to take things apart and we can understand the mechanism. In this domain, that may not be very effective because, for example, one of the things that we see when we do psychokinetic experiments is that it seems to involve teleology, that it's knowing that the thing has already worked in the future, right? So the future event is already finished and you're getting pulled towards that. So this is now a retrocausal mechanism. It's the future pulling you into some state. This is perfectly fine within physics at an elementary particle level, but we almost never see anything like that happening at the macroscopic scale. And so to say nothing of, it seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics. So there's an enormous amount of resistance within the physics community, not all, but many, don't like the idea at all that we live in a universe that has teleology in it. Nevertheless, that seems to be what's going on in this case. The mind thinks of something and the whole rest of the universe comes along and makes that happen simply because we have the capacity to create anything that we want. And the reason that we can't create all these things, like make the gold-plated Mercedes suddenly appear, probably has something to do with the fact that there's doubt behind it. Like don't really think I could do that. You know, I could do it at this level, but not like a real working car. So that doubt will stop it, combined with 8 billion other people who are thinking, oh, no, that's ridiculous. Well, you have to overcome that too, to say nothing of, if it did happen, you probably shouldn't ever tell anybody about it. This is why sorcerers' secrets are so important. You never can admit to anybody that you did that, because the moment that you did, you'd have CNN trucks in front of your house watching you all the time. And nobody wants that either. So it becomes quite tricky when you do miracles on demand. So I publish everything that I work on because that's the way that I'm trying to push the envelope, but I don't always admit how things happen.
Would you say it's the quantum field that's listening and responding?
I think that our current ideas about quantum mechanics are the latest effort in physics to understand the physical world. It's important because it opens two doorways that we didn't have before with classical physics. It's the doorway of non-locality, which is important, and also the doorway that something about observation makes a difference. So those are both important, but quantum mechanics as we currently understand it is not the end of physics. It's the beginning of physics. And quantum mechanics in maybe its next iteration or maybe beyond that is almost certainly going to have consciousness as part of the equation. Physicists today are very resistant to that idea because suddenly they can't just do physics. They also have to think about philosophy and psychology and everything. They don't like that. But something like that is going to be necessary in order to make a big advancement in physics. And I know plenty of physicists who are working on this issue quietly. So is it the quantum field? Not in the way that we currently think of it, but something like that.
Thank you, Mark, for your question. Okay, so now we have Mark number 2. Mark, what is your question?
Oh, hello. That are in fact working on this to make it fun for the masses, something that can be, wow, look, this is real and it's enjoyable and it works, so that, these centers around the country can bring it to a larger audience, the non-believers.
Well, doing it as a brain-computer interface, yes. So there are people working on virtual reality with brain-computer interface, and that's kind of in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Working at it purely with consciousness, I don't know anybody who's trying to commercialize that. And it can be commercialized for sure. I mean, there are all kinds of game-like things that could be done. the effects generally are small enough so that it would be difficult to make something, even as a toy, that would work well enough that people would actually want to buy it.
Work well enough.
So I would say the opportunity is there. It's probably easier now to launch things on the web, which is why we're using that within our GCP 2.0 than to make gizmos. Even though I have plenty of ideas about how to make gizmos. I mean, we can make software that is an experiment involving the plasma ball. It costs maybe $50 or something. Would people want to play with that? Sure they would. And the other thing I want to mention is a lot of people, including here, are doing spoon bending things. So here's one that I bent. And I was only interested in this particular kind of bend because it's extremely difficult to do by force. And I did it myself. And I checked my fingers and I wasn't using force. So to advance the state of the art there, rather than simply showing that it's possible, I've been working with a metallurgist and asking him, what could we do in order to take advantage of the enthusiasm and people are able to do this, to actually tell us what happened? Because, I mean, it's a permanent physical object. You can do all kinds of metallurgy on it. So he actually did come up with a bunch of ideas about certain kinds of aluminum that are like, it's called 1100 aluminum. It's one of the alloys. Extremely difficult to bend. It will not bend. So if you make a 1/4 inch by a 1/4 inch by a 4-inch bar of this stuff, and I got a quote on how much it would cost to do that, you could send that out to people and you'd coat it with thermal paint and a couple of other things to indicate whether somebody used pliers or some other force to bend it versus something else. Well, if the something else occurred, these things are optically flat. You would know immediately because they're no longer flat, even a tiny little bend. You can then look at the crystalline structure of the aluminum and begin to understand, how did that thing bend? So we have guesses based on work that was done in the 70s, but we still to this day don't really understand, this should be impossible. Well, it's not impossible. Something happened. But if you look and start doing the metallurgy on this, it's too complicated. This was stamped into this shape and it changes the whole crystalline structure. So using these pieces of aluminum alloys that are made with very specific crystalline structures, you're able to actually look at it under an electron microscope and find out why it bent, which tells us more about, like, clues about the underlying mechanism. So the estimate I got was to make these bars would cost $60 a bar, because, who needs bars like that? Nobody. So they'd have to custom make it. But that would be kind of a citizen science thing, right? There's plenty of groups doing this sort of thing. Maybe we bought them in bulk, maybe it's $10 a piece. So we'd send them out to a bunch of people and they say, if you bend this thing, send it back. We'll have the metallurgy done, and maybe we can actually figure out what was going on here.
That sounds like a great idea. And for all of you guys, we just got $150 worth of silver-plated spoons to do the graduate school bending. So that'll be happening in Sedona on the first Sunday of next month, and also online. Jeffrey, we'd like to have your question, and that will probably wrap us up for the evening. So.
First of all, Dean, I just want to tell you, I admire your work and your due diligence with all what you've done and the details in which you've done it with. But I'm curious if you had read the paper or familiar with the paper from Nassim Haramein, William Brown, and Amara Van Baker called The Unified Space Memory Network from Cosmogenesis to Consciousness. And if you have any comments on that, if not, I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
I don't know that paper. I'm familiar with some of the other papers that he's written. Generally, if I look at a title of a paper and I can't pronounce it quickly, it goes into a very large pile of papers that I want to get to at some point. But I have doing so many other things that I generally can't get to it quickly, because I know I have to work through multi-syllabic jargon. It takes so long to really absorb it that I don't want to spend the time.
It's fairly simple, actually, but yeah, I know you have to use that. You have to use that scientific language when they're talking about stuff, but it's I mean, the jargon is important because it's a shorthand way that
if the other people reading it know what you're talking about, you don't have to keep using the same words again and again. But if you're approaching it de novo and you don't really know these concepts, it can mess with your brain. Also, Harriman is more of a theorist. Like, I'm an empiricist. I can easily deal with data and understand how experiments are done. My brain does not work very well with theory. And one of the reasons why I don't do that is partially it's a matter of simply the way of thinking or something. But the other thing is that I noticed that people who develop theories to describe how these things work generally want to develop a theory of everything that explains everything. And they're convinced that it does, to which I would say, well, how can we test whether this is true or not? Right? Because otherwise, if they can't give me a clear answer to say what would falsify your theory, any kind of experiment, like regardless of how much it would cost or anything, most theorists cannot do that. Because the moment you develop a theory where you think it describes everything, it can't be falsified, because by definition it includes everything. Well, that's not a very good theory. So that's why I avoid theory.
Well, I will just say Nassim did predict the charge radius of proton that later became experimentally measured. So he's got that one nailed good. And very shortly, the paper coming out will have been able to identify the source of all the basic constants in science. So it should be coming out at the beginning of 2022, it should be pretty exciting for the scientific community.
Yes,
I'm pretty excited.
If you can develop a theory which starts saying the constants are this way because of this,
that's what's happening.
You still need this. You still need another step which says either this is a way to falsify the theory, or that no one has seen this yet, but I predict that because this theory says if you do this, this, and this, you'll get that. That would be amazing. That would be a breakthrough.
It should do that in many ways, as it has done with the prediction of the charge radius of the proton that he predicted before the measurement, which was 4% different than the standard model. So he nailed that one. And I think we're going to be nailing a lot more coming out from Nassim and his gang.
Great.
You know, speaking of Nassim, I almost forgot that this is the last question because we're out of time, but one of the questions that we promoted as we were doing this was levitation. And Nassim told me that he's been able to do that. And you've documented it in your history of magic in your book as being documented. What do you think is going on with that? I mean, talk about levitation.
Something about gravity.
Spin.
Yeah, I mean, torsion, spin. We don't know. It's something to do with our understanding of gravity that we don't understand very well. And by the way, I was invited once to the TM University to watch the world's best yogic flyers. And of course, the yogic flyers are not really flying, they're jumping. And so it was clear that there was ballistic jumping going on. They're in full lotus and they're jumping up and down. I've tried to do that and I can't budge. So I'm not an athlete, but nevertheless, these were 4 young guys bouncing all over the place. They weren't even breathing heavily. So it looked kind of anomalous to me. They were clearly jumping, but either they're the world's best athletes or they were getting some kind of an assist or something. And not only that, they were jumping and clearly in a blissful state because they weren't exactly laughing, but they had these kind of smiles that when I look at somebody smiling like that, I think I'm suspicious. Like they're just way too happy. No one should be that happy, especially while they're doing an enormous amount of effort to be jumping like this. So I would say it looked peculiar. I don't understand exactly how they were able to do that, but they were not levitating. And I asked John Hagelin, who was there at the time, and I said, well, has anybody ever levitated for at least a millisecond? The answer is no. No one has floated at all.
St. Joseph back in the day.
Yeah, so we don't know what St. Joseph did. He's different somehow.
Yeah. It was documented in many ways. So if you had one wish for your lab this year in 2022, what is the thing you wish for most in terms of like results or something? What are you really hoping for? And like, if you have anything else you want to do to close out the interview or tell us about, we invite you to do that.
Well, so our lab has actually been shut since March of 2020. So we haven't done anything in the lab since then. We don't know at this point if and or when it will be reopened. So I guess and as a result, many of our people have scattered, right? So we're now all over the place.
Wow.
And we're actually more effective than we were before.
Hmm.
This is what's happening with a lot of people, like nonprofits that are doing webinars and stuff. We have over 20,000 more members now than we did before, because we would do, like, every Friday we have a webinar. We're attracting people around the world in a way we could not have done before. So we will continue to do that. And we're now creating what amounts to a virtual lab where, and maybe working with Heart Math and maybe with the Monroe Institute, to create a way of doing physiological tests where we would mail people the equipment, and then we get real-time data streaming over the internet so that we'd be able to do these kinds of remote experiments. And among other things, attract people who may have talent that would never be able to come to our lab. So we're moving more and more into a virtual space simply because it's so much more efficient and much, much cheaper.
That's super exciting. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. That's like, yeah, Monroe Institute, Heart Math, and IONS. Whew. And then the most talented people in the world. Well, I'm glad that you're attracting that into your field. And I'm glad that you're expanding your research, because everyday people do want to come and show how extraordinary they are. So thank you for being so extraordinary, Dean. You are such a lighthouse for so many scientists and so many curious people. And I hope that it doesn't feel like an uphill battle for the rest of your career, because I know it's been hard sometimes to bring some of this science forward, and it's much appreciated, all the hard work that you've done to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, I would not do this if I felt it was a struggle all the time.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I'm driven by the curiosity of it, and the fact that there are stubborn people out there in the world. Oh well, that's their problem.
Yeah.